Today I wanted to tell you a story about my mom. And it's a funny story now, but it wasn't back then when she went through this. But I'm going to use that story to explain what the fear response looks like in our brains and how to help with that as well. Before I get started, my name is Hannah. I'm a licensed therapist in the state of Florida, and this is the Reflection Room. My mom went to college at the University of Tennessee, and if you didn't know, it's really close to the Smoky Mountains. She would go up there instead of studying, and she would go on hikes and just hang out in nature, which would be really nice, but back then, when she was in college, they didn't have cell phones. If you got lost, you were out of luck. One time my mom went up there, and she got stuck because her car broke down. So she was on a windy road just on the side waiting for somebody to come and find her or help her fix her car, but she couldn't really do anything. So she was just waiting there. But the problem with that was my grandma, her mom, loves to give people food as they walk out the door. Of course, in normal grandma fashion, when my mom had left to go back to Knoxville for school, she had thrown a bunch of Little Debbie's and snacks in her trunk. So she was up in the mountains, stuck with Little Debbie sugary sweet smells coming out of her car, and a bear loves those smells. So you can see where this is going. She was sitting there by herself when a bear started circling her car, a big bear. Just constantly circling her car, trying to figure out how to get in so it could get those Little Debbies, because they love to dig through trash. Not saying that Little Debbies are trash, because they are delightful, but in this situation, not helpful. She was just waiting there in fear, trying to figure out what to do, when a new park ranger had driven by and saw what was happening. But this park ranger must have been her first day, but she really didn't know what to do. And instead of calling for backup, she gets out of the car and out of fear hops into my mom's car. So now they're both in my mom's car, trapped as this bear is circling and trying to get in their car. So eventually the bear just got tired enough of trying and went on its way, and they were able to get out. And I don't think she went up there for a long time after that, or at least not alone. But I do want to talk about what was probably happening to her brain in that moment, or that extended period of time, because that is while the bear is circling your car. So before I explain what happens to your brain, I need to tell you about two parts of your brain. There's the amygdala, and that's what controls our fear response. So it pumps out the adrenaline, and it shuts down the rest of your body that doesn't need to be working while you're in survival mode. And it also pumps all of your blood from your torso to your limbs for the fight or flight, because you either have to run or you have to fight. But there's 4 different fear responses. So I'm going to talk about all of them. But in this moment, my mom probably froze, as she couldn't do much else. But our body typically picks for us what we're going to do, unfortunately. That's the amygdala. It's a little nugget. And then we have our prefrontal cortex. So that's this front part of our brain right here. And that controls critical thinking skills. So what happens when the amygdala, our little nugget, is activated is it kind of shuts down our prefrontal cortex, and we can't think as clearly. You can't make decisions or have deep conversations, or those are less likely to happen just because that functioning isn't needed. Your only needed skills are survival skills, and that amygdala is going to take over for you. So in a normal circumstance, when there's a life or death scenario right in front of you, that's awesome. Like, we need that survival technique. Our amygdala is very valuable in those moments. But when we don't have a life or death situation in front of us, and maybe we have an anxiety disorder or PTSD, that amygdala is activated all the time for no reason. And we're just trying to live everyday life, but we're in survival mode because our brain thinks we're in a life or death situation. So that's where it can get a little complicated. But for example, my mom in this situation, it was very valid. Her fear was extremely valid, and her brain needed to act that way. I'm going to give you this little visual to help you understand what happens. If this is our brain, this is our prefrontal cortex, right here where our critical thinking skills are. And then on the inside is our amygdala. And it's a little tiny nugget hidden in the middle of our brain. So when we go into that fear response, we quite literally flip our lid where we don't really need the prefrontal cortex anymore, and the amygdala takes over. So now this is in control, and our body starts to go into fight or flight mode, or freeze or appease. But we're ready to run, we're ready to fight, we're either really calm and still. And in front of a bear, that's also valid, because sometimes you do need to act very calm and still. Or appease, or fawn, which is basically, I'll do whatever you want, don't hurt me. That happens a lot of times in domestic violence relationships, or like pleading for your survival kind of thing. So that's what happens when the amygdala takes over. So we don't really control anything after that. And they also call it the lizard brain. So lizard brain meaning that's the very bare minimum we need for survival, because lizards don't really have critical thinking skills. They just have survival mechanisms. After we get through the life-threatening situation, or if we have an anxiety disorder like PTSD, we need to calm it down so we can flip back our lid and get our prefrontal cortex all nice and working again. And that can be difficult. For example, our practice for the reflection room is located in Tampa Bay, and recently we had 2 hurricanes in 13 days. So a lot of people in this area, and I know other parts of the country as well that were affected by these hurricanes, are still stuck in that survival mode, because we quite literally had to face life or death within 13 days. And hurricanes are very drawn out. Whereas if you think of tornadoes, like I'm from Tennessee, so tornadoes are more common up there. You have 5 minutes before you have to make a decision for life or death, like where you're going to hide. You have to jump in a shelter, or the basement, or a room with no windows, or if you're driving, you have to find a ditch and jump out and hide in the ditch as fast as you can. It's a very split-second thinking process. But with hurricanes, it's more drawn out, because you have days where you're thinking, I could do this, or I need to get water and these supplies, and I need to prepare for no power, or I need to evacuate. How do I get out of town? Is there enough gas? So there's all of these thoughts running through your brain, and then that lasts days before the storm, during the storm especially, and then post-storm. All of the days afterwards where you're trying to get back to normal, but nothing is quite back to normal. There's all kinds of reasons why your brain would still be in survival mode long time after a storm or hurricane. That's a real life example of what's been going on here. And our brains, we just need to get their prefrontal cortex back down to normal. Talking about ways to help get back to normal is doing exactly that. Trying to find things that are normal for you and getting back to doing that. It can be hard, but any way that you can possibly find to make yourself feel a little bit normal, like eating a meal, a hot meal, or getting the proper nutrition that you needed, trying to get back to work, just trying to do like the bare minimum of anything normal for you can help a little bit in that situation. And then, of course, it takes a little bit of time. But there are some other practical ways to help with calming down your nervous system. But there is one specific coping skill that I love that goes along with EMDR. And as an EMDR trained therapist, I use this even with clients that I don't use EMDR with. There's a term called bilateral stimulation, and that basically is the eye movement back and forth that we do when we sleep during REM sleep. But we can do a slower version of bilateral stimulation that's called calming bilateral stimulation. So it's a much slower version of it, and there's a few different ways you can try it. We can do a butterfly technique, so you put your thumbs on your collarbones, and you do a slow tap like this. Just a very slow tap on either side of your body so that you're getting that bilateral stimulation. So the back and forth using both sides of your brain. So you tap like this. You could also do a hug. So you just hug yourself and tap slowly. Or you could tap your knees very slowly. Another good way if you want to be more physically active and burn off some of the adrenaline that rushes through your body in the fear response is walking. Because walking is calming bilateral stimulation because your legs are going and you're using each leg interchangeably. So I wouldn't recommend walking fast though, because that's just going to raise your heart rate and then your adrenaline will start pumping again. But we want to get it nice and calm. So a nice saunter, a nice little stroll outside if you can, that helps a lot with calming down your nervous system. And then if you want to add on to that, you can add on a positive belief. So these are beliefs that are true, but you may not believe them to be true in the moment. But we want to do something that is positive, is helpful, and calming. So in this situation, you could say, I am safe. You can just tap and say, I am safe, and just repeatedly do that until you feel your nervous system start to calm down, your heart rate start to lower, and you could choose any kind of positive belief that you want. So that's one way to help regulate your nervous system. And you can also do that when you're just feeling, say you do have an anxiety disorder, then if you start to feel that coming up and there's no real trigger, there's no real life or death situation that you should be afraid of, using CBLS or calming bilateral stimulation does help a lot with that. So that will help bring you down a little bit and get you into a normal headspace because we want to flip down that lid. Another helpful coping skill is a grounding technique. So this is part of mindfulness. So a lot of times when people experience anxiety, our head spirals out of control with different scenarios or different stories or what could happen or what if this happened. And we start to go off on those branches and then it just gets out of control. So mindfulness and grounding helps you stay in the moment, you're in the present. You don't want to get trapped in those what ifs because they're all what ifs and they're usually the worst case scenario. So this one will help you ground yourself in the current moment by using all 5 of your senses. So you start with 5 things you can see. So you look around you and you find 5 things you can see and you describe them to yourself. So I could say, that's my bookshelf. It's a dark wood. I don't know what I would name that. Coffee brown, maybe. And then I would go to the next thing, like my carpet's got green stripes on it. And you go down the list. So there's 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch. And I want you to actually touch them and then describe how they feel. So I could say, my necklace has some bumps on it. It's not very smooth. It's smooth on the back. And then I could go down the list, 4 things that you can touch. And you do 3 things you can hear. So you have to stop and listen to different things like the air conditioner running, or I can hear cars going down the road, my own voice. And then you go to 2 things you can smell. So this is where it gets a little bit more difficult. So you have to find things you can smell. And I usually recommend you can use your shirt, smell the laundry detergent, or your hair if you can. And the last one is 1 thing you can taste. And that one's hard if you don't have anything around you. But if you can find something, it's usually really helpful. So in that grounding technique, you use all 5 of your senses to physically ground you in the present moment. Because you have to look at all of your surroundings and feel all your surroundings and taste and smell and hear. So that one is just called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And you can use that as well to help ground yourself. So those are 3 coping skills that I do recommend when your fear response is activated. And that's trying to get some normalcy, using the CBLS, calming bilateral stimulation, or the grounding technique. But I do recommend therapy if this is a prolonged problem. As this podcast or this video is not a substitute for therapy, it can be helpful, but I do recommend seeking therapy if you notice frequent panic attacks or high anxiety, or feel like you feel like you live in a survival mode all the time, because that's not where we want to live. We want to be able to have those deeper conversations and critical thinking skills where we can problem solve and use our brain to the full potential. We don't want to be stuck in that lizard brain because they don't know what they're doing. So I do recommend talking to a therapist if it does keep going, because a repeated traumatic experience is complex trauma. So that does become a little bit harder to cope with when it's repeated. So for example, with these 2 hurricanes in 13 days, people had just gotten done trying to get back to normal, or hadn't even gotten back to normal yet, and then had to start all over with a whole process of, am I going to evacuate? How do I prepare my home for this? Do I need these supplies? Trying to figure out all of that out again within 2 weeks. So that we would classify it as complex trauma. And it can be a little bit harder to deal with. So talking to somebody is totally okay. Thank you for joining me today on The Reflection Room. And until next time, keep reflecting.